My role this evening is to act as chair, so I'm going to open the discussion by asking Bruce to begin by telling us a little bit about how he came to write this book and what he hopes it's achieved, particularly what he feels is new about his own take on a city that may seem familiar to many. So over to you, Bruce.
Indeed, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, as you said, there's much that is familiar in the story of Athens, and I hope something a little bit unfamiliar about my approach. First of all, on a very personal note, I mean, the story of Athens in sort of very recent decades is one that I've lived myself, in the sense that, Athens was actually the first city of any kind that I ever lived in. As a penniless sort of 17-year-old and school leaver, having grown up in the wilds of Northern Ireland, I found myself, making a living in Athens, 1976. It was the first city whose bus routes I got to know. It was the first city whose geography I got to know. And I've been back there professionally again and again and again. I spent 4 formative years, for me anyway, as a Reuters correspondent, the first expatriate Reuters correspondent who was sent to Athens. That was 82 to 86. So those fiery years of Andreas Papandreou in full flight as a radical leader, the most radical leader in the European community, those were my years in Athens too. And I've been going back and back and back and living the changes, and including during the worst moments of the economic crisis, but also quite extensively 2018, 2019, when the city was, relatively speaking, recovering from the economic crisis. So, I mean, I really bear the story of Athens sort of in my own skin in a certain way. Now, looking more broadly about what anybody else has tried to do about Athens or indeed about other cities, I mean, there are plenty of longue durée books about cities that have come out recently and have worked very well. And of course, I'll freely acknowledge my debt to Bettany's book on Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities, namely Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul, particularly the way in which she draws different epochs of the city together and sort of makes them, in a sense, simultaneous, so that new discoveries about geology or about new insights into the Byzantine period, for example, become very hot issues in the modern politics of Turkey. It's not actually possible to separate the different epochs of history diachronically. And I hope I was a little bit faithful to that spirit as well. In fact, Bettany and I appeared on a rather eccentric Radio 4 program, didn't we? Which was based on the hypothesis that there was something useful to compare between the Nikar riots, between the blues and the greens, supporters of different sort of racing teams in Constantinople, and the more recent riots in Istanbul, the Gezi Park riots. And we both had to kind of give our contribution to that rather sort of bold and eccentric thesis. But I mean, in terms of other books of longue durée history, I mean, we have Peter Ackroyd on London. We have Robert Hughes, best known as a historian of his native Australia. He wrote a very, very long and personal book about Rome. The idea of a longue durée book about Athens presents particular challenges, which we can elaborate on. Most obviously, the fact that there are long periods when either nothing much happens, or if it did happen, we don't know much about it. Especially the very elusive second half of the first Christian millennium, say 500 to 1000, one really struggles to find any evidence of what was happening in Athens during that period. So there are gaps. It hasn't been a continuously important place in the way that Istanbul or Rome has been. But nonetheless, I tried to work around that. And I suppose I tried to emphasize the fact that whatever else changed, whether Athens was a village or a mighty city, or a small outpost in somebody else's empire, the geography obviously remained the same. The mountains were the same. The proximity to the sea was the same. The Acropolis itself, above all, remained the same. Its strategic importance never disappeared, and its spiritual importance never disappeared. And likewise, the mountains, Imitos, Pendeli, to use the modern Greek pronunciations, Egalio, they were always there. They were always significant. Even the rivers, sadly covered over these days. But there are certain constants in the geography of Athens, which I feel played a part in every epoch of the city's history. And that's what I tried to bring out.
Thanks very much, Bruce. And I think that very, very nicely summarizes the way I certainly read the book. So it worked, at least certainly for me. We thought it might be useful to do it roughly chronologically. So I'm going to ask Bettany to start with a few questions, but don't feel that we have to confine ourselves narrowly to any particular period. But so over to you, Bettany.
Thank you so much. And just to explain to people who are watching, I'm standing in the lobby of a small guest house in Jordan, having been filming at Shobak Castle all day. So forgive me if there's any noise and kind of transition to and fro. This is the only place in the region that has Wi-Fi. So bear with me, but what a total delight it is to be here and to celebrate Bruce's extraordinary book. I mean, Bruce, you're being very modest to say there are other books that have this kind of longue durée and deal with a city in such an expansive style, because as you mentioned, first of all, that's a hard thing to do, to jigsaw puzzle together these fragments of evidence that there are, and the lacunae and the gaps in between. But actually more to the continuity across time is extraordinary, as you say. And just one thing I'd love to ask you about, you mentioned spirituality, and the book is titled Athens, City of Wisdom. And obviously wisdom has a spiritual aspect to Athenians through time, but actually particularly in what is often described as the golden age of Athens in the 5th century BCE. So I just wondered, a tricky question in a way to start with, but how do you define wisdom in relation to Athens? And also thinking about the Acropolis, as you say, this absolute brooding presence in the city. Just it'd be interesting to hear a little more about that as a spiritual rock, because the rock itself was considered sacred, as you describe in the book. So what is wisdom for you? Why is wisdom spiritual in relation to Athens? And what place does the Acropolis hold as a kind of magnetic force of spirit in the city?
Well, maybe just to go with wisdom first and sort of to explain the title. I mean, I suppose, what I had in mind is that Athens was a center of learning and knowledge and philosophy and rhetoric for much, much longer than it was a place of any geopolitical importance. I mean, really, its geopolitical importance peaked, of course, in the 5th century BC. It was sort of moderately important still in the 4th century BC until the Macedonian conquest, but it remained intellectually important for 700 or 800 years after that. A place where intelligent young people from all over the East Mediterranean would gather and consider ultimate questions and learn the arts of presentation and linguistic skills. So it was this, it was at a minimum, I mean, it was a place of braininess. I mean, it was like Oxford or Tübingen or Salamanca or whatever. It was a place that we had an intellectual importance that vastly dwarfed its rather small geopolitical importance. I mean, that's an obvious wisdom point. But then on the deeper point about what's the nature of wisdom and what sort of wisdom was pursued in Athens, but it seems to me that sort of the way that the Acropolis and its monuments and indeed the nearby hills is presented to the world, very much emphasizes democracy, rule of law, proper procedure. When Barack Obama went in 2016 to the Parthenon, he said, as many a Western leader has done, I mean, isn't it wonderful to be coming to the place where democracy was born? And well and good, I don't question that for a moment. But that, of course, obscures the spiritual importance. The reason why it's known as the Yera Vrachos, the Holy Rock. Not just the surface of the rock, but also the caves, the many caves and cavities inside the rock, each of which had its own cults and its own dedications and so on. Now, I mean, ancient Athenian religion is elusive to us. And, even the precise role of the Parthenon is elusive. I mean, temples in the ancient world were not places where you went and prayed. They were places where votive statues were kept, and the praying and sacrificing generally, went on nearby, out of doors. The role of the Erechtheion, on the face of things, a more holy place than the Parthenon. So lots of things remain elusive. But even if we look at the business conducted by the Democratic Assembly of Athens, as far as we can reconstruct it, in the 5th and the 4th century, in some ways the information we have about the 4th century is richer than the 5th century. I mean, a huge proportion of the resolutions which they adopted concerned the fine-tuning of religious ritual. I mean, who should be worshipped where and by whom and in what way. So of course, as people who are proud of our secular democracy, we tend to project onto ancient Athens, our very secular ideas about separation of church and state. But in fact, the ancient Athenian democracy seemed to consider it a very, very important part of its own business, to tell people how to worship, who should be doing the worship, and where exactly, by what procedure. So that's in a sense, well, one of the symptoms of the intense spirituality of what happened in the Acropolis and in all the surrounding hills as well.
I'm always very touched by the fact that when you visit Athens today, some of those niches in the Acropolis rock itself that were originally sacred to Aphrodite, people still go there and make little offerings of pomegranates and milk and seal stones. So it absolutely has kept that kind of spiritual / supernatural gloss to it, in a sense, particularly the rock of the Acropolis itself. And I think as you say, there is this sort of passionate, fervent search for wisdom in its broadest sense, that obviously it's something which pertains to ideas, but is also something that pertains to consequence of action, which is, of course, something which the great philosophers of Athens deal with. I'm always particularly tickled by the fact that wisdom and history are two words that share prehistoric Proto-Indo-European roots, if you believe in Proto-Indo-European as a kind of common base. We think it probably starts with this conjunction of wid tor, which is a wise agent, and history itself is a wise agent. And certainly, as you say, there is to be ahistorical, there is almost a sort of messianic search for wisdom in the city of Athens. And one of the casualties of that, of course, is a man whom we both love, Bruce, Socrates, and what happens to him through his life and then trial in the city. Famously, one of the charges against him is rejecting the city's gods and inviting new gods to the city. But what do you think about that challenge of blasphemy? Do you think that was an excuse on behalf of the Athenians, or do you think he did offend their religious sensibilities?
Well, maybe the answer is both. I mean, certainly you can very well make the case that it was just an excuse, in the sense that Socrates, maddeningly, I mean, he refused to be categorized either in either of the main political camps in Athens. He wasn't in the democratic camp, and he wasn't in the oligarchic camp, was not straightforwardly so anyway. It reminds me a bit actually of what it was like to be a journalist in Moscow in the very early 90s, around the time when communism was falling. And we had this very binary idea of people, public figures in Russia, that they were either in favor of reform or they were conservatives. They either wanted to keep elements of the old communist system, or they wanted to dismantle it and create something a bit more Western in its economic arrangements and its political arrangements. It seemed to me that we were ignoring the possibility that something entirely different might happen, and indeed something entirely different has happened. Now, Socrates, likewise, it was maddeningly impossible to categorize, and he refused to categorize himself. From the point of view of the Democrats, it seemed that his indifference to politics was tantamount almost to being to siding with the oligarchs. When there was outright civil war, and when the Democrats went into self-exile, he didn't follow them. He stayed in the city, And by some people's lights, that was a way of a kind of surrender almost to the power of the oligarchs. Yet when he was asked to carry out a citizen's arrest, by the oligarchs, he refused to do so. So he has some democratic credentials too, which he didn't, which he reminded people of. Now, setting the context for his trial, the civil war between oligarchs and democrats, had been ended on terms of amnesty. A bit, as I say in the book, a bit like the dictatorship in Argentina. There was an agreement to forget, and there was agreement that there would be no prosecutions directly pertaining to the dictatorship which had gone before. And so you can certainly argue that getting at Socrates, who was seen as a sort of fellow traveler almost with the oligarchs, was a way for the Democrats to make their point. And so you have these rather aggressive figures in the Democratic camp, like Anytus, who seem to be out to get Socrates, and he's an easier target to get than any of the outright oligarchs would have been. So there's certainly a perfectly good case to be made for the fact that the blasphemy was just an excuse for someone that they wanted to get on political grounds, and yet I think I've been persuaded that blasphemy did matter to the ordinary Athenian. It did matter to the kind of people who would have made up the jury, and the charge of not properly respecting the city's gods and introducing other gods, unomizin, it's something that an ordinary Athenian would have taken very seriously. It would have felt that maybe if things are going wrong in the city, it's because we're not doing religion right. And just think of the way in which Alcibiades was discredited. Rightly or wrongly, he was accused of mimicking the Eleusinian mysteries, almost the equivalent of a black mass or something, and that was obviously a very, very damning indictment. And so I think there's a perfectly good case for a political prosecution, but the charges would have been seen as very serious by ordinary Athenians. I think we can probably get that far.
Absolutely. And of course, to remember that there is at this point no separate word for religion per se, because gods and demigods and spirits are everywhere and in everything, in every breath of wind, and every time you open a door, one could cross your hearth. So as you say, in a way, we're creating a false distinction actually by kind of imagining that you couldn't have an anxiety about a religious offence if you felt that that he was offending the city in some way. And we could obviously talk about Socrates for 6 hours between us tonight, but we must not do that. And I know that John wants to talk about some of the kind of later chapters of your book as well. But just one other thing to ask, because of course Socrates is somebody who speaks freely on the city streets for close on 70 years, and then seems to be condemned for that very liberty of speech. And liberty and freedom are ideas that the Athenians play with the whole time. Again, Bruce, as you know, they name warships freedom. They name warships freedom of speech and liberty. But one of the ways that they controlled that was through ostracism. This very pertinent, very physical act of scratching a name onto an ostraka, onto a fragment of pottery. Ostracism is something that you play with in the book, and I'm very interested because I think you've got some quite new ideas in a way about how ostracism worked in the city of Athens.
Thank you. Well, I was lucky enough to meet two wonderful scholars who have dedicated sort of quiet, self-effacing lives to studying literally every scrap of physical evidence that you can find about ostracism. And their names are Jim Sickinger of the Florida State University and Stefan Brenner of Gießen University. And they've both put in sort of a couple of decades each to literally examining every single shard. Now, Stefan Brenner has focused on the 9,000 or so fragments that have been found, in the Kerameikos area, and he's got to the point, he says, where he can actually hear the voices of the people who were scratching the words on the shards. I mean, just to sort of recall the basics of ostracism. It was a system whereby people at the beginning of every year people could vote, first of all, on do we want to expel someone? Is it a good idea? Do we feel in the mood to expel someone? And then 7 or 8 weeks later, and who do we want to expel? And there was an unpopularity contest, sort of who do we most feel like removing from the city for 10 years. Now, it was in many ways a very sort of mild and civilized punishment, in the sense that it did not make the victim a criminal. The victim did not lose any property. If it was a rich person, he could actually continue to manage his property from his place of exile. But it was just a way of saying, we'd rather not have you in the city's affairs for 10 years or so. And if there's an emergency, we might call you back. But if there isn't an emergency, you better not come back, because it's the death penalty. Now, what Stefan Brenner discovered is that, it was much, much more extensively used and a much more extensive part of Athenian life than you would guess from written sources alone. And the written sources refer to about a dozen individuals who were either the victims or near victims of ostracism. And you can actually follow the twists and turns of Athenian politics in the 5th century through ostracism alone, right from the debates about, do we want a new navy? Do we want to spend money on the navy? Every single public debate in Athens had its played out in the field of ostracism. But Stefan Brenner has come to the conclusion that the great majority of the fines, of the 9,000 fines, pertain to one particular year, which is 471. And of course, he can find plenty of evidence for high politics being played out, Themistocles being one of the candidates, and in his view, the successful candidate, so to speak, the following year. But also lots of petty personal feuds. And just anybody you just didn't like the face of, or anybody you just felt it would be nice to be rid of him. And he reckoned about 100 people altogether in that one single year were actually named as possible candidates for ostracism. So it was a vast phenomenon, going well beyond the dozen or so names that we have in written sources. Now, of course, one of the most famous ostraca is the one denouncing Kimon, and one of Kimon's sort of weak points was his half-sister Elpiniki, who was unpopular and pushy, so people said. And there's a famous ostracon which says, "Take Elpiniki and go, lavon Elpinikin ite." And I must say, when I saw that, I immediately said, I've heard something like this before. This reminds me of something. Now, I'm not quite old enough to have been present at the anti-royalist riots in Greece in the mid-60s, not quite old enough, but I do remember people talking about them. And one of the slogans in the anti-royalist riots of that period was, "Vence thelio laos, parti manasou kebros." The people don't want you, take your mother and go, which is what the crowd shouted at the young Constantine. So I felt that there was a certain continuity in the kind of street politics of Athens.
Absolutely. And also, as you say, kind of matters both great and small, because it's one of the most, I have to say, one of the most depressing things I found about archaeology in Athens is the number of curse tablets that there are when you excavate wells, these lead curse tablets. What you find are ABC, so people practicing to read and write, which feels like a good thing. And then these unbelievably petty, but vitriolic diatribes against neighbors for, people's fences being too close to yours, or keeping bees when you shouldn't. But people wishing dreadful things on their neighbors, with their arms dropping off, their eyes falling out. You do feel, and in a way, that is the flip side, isn't it, of the coin that is Athens, that it is a city where, it recognizes absolutely that it's not that man is the measure of all things, but man's relationship with man is the measure of all things. And it's a city that, both rubs up, where people rub up against each other and people explore the sparks that are going to fly when that happens. So no, but I just want to say thank you for bringing that scholarship to kind of a wider audience through the book, because it feels like it's an incredibly important part of the character of the city that again can be kind of rather conveniently overlooked sometimes.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see that we're halfway through our time, so I wonder whether we should move forward.
Let's move on to John, but no obligation to talk only about the near present or the near past.
Very good. Well, thank you for my invitation to take part in this evening. It was a great thrill, really, to be asked to take part, because it's a book I very much admire. Although this is the last of the BSA's trilogy, Each of these three books has been a fantastic read, and I do really mean that. The read itself has been truly fluent, and I sat down and just read it from cover to cover, as I'm sure many people will have done. I guess this is what one expects from economists, journalists and The Economist, a very good read. Actually, what I liked about the book was thinking before I opened it, what use would be a book about Athens rather than Greece as a whole, Greece, a global history, or whatever, is that you've shown that Athens is a city which doesn't have a single life. It's not a history that is continuous. Of course, there's a thread of continuity. There's never been a period without a population, but that thread has sometimes been extremely thin, and the quality of the polis, of the politia around the city has really, really varied over the years. And through your diachronic sweep, you've done something which I think has been actually rather a useful corrective to a period when we've been thinking about Greek history across 3 millennia. Actually, in its capital, in Athens itself, you see something rather different from the sweep of Greek history in toto. And that, I think, comes across very strongly in the book. Rather as Bettany said, as she set off to question you about the book, I was also struck, and perhaps again this is because you're The Economist's religion editor, I was also struck by the emphasis that you put on the spiritual lives of Athenians across these 3 millennia. And of course, I started thinking about Dodds and the Greeks and the irrational, and rather rejoicing that you had, from the outset, not fallen into what I think is the trap set by classicists of simply seeing Athens as the Enlightenment dream. You tell a much richer story of the lives of the Athenians. And I was also really, really pleased and excited when you got into late antiquity to see that you were willing also to talk about this very interesting period as what was still a pagan city, as it was in the 4th century, morphs into something recognizably Christian. I guess many of your readers will have been surprised to see 2 of the great early Christian intellectuals, Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus, as students in the city in the middle of the 4th century. So tell us a bit more about that, Bruce. Why were they there in this pagan city? What were they doing, and how important was Athens in their intellectual lives and the trajectory on which Greece as a whole was embarked?
Well, I suppose the formal answer would be that they were there because Athens was still par excellence a sort of a university town for the Hellenic world. And it was a place where you went to refine your pedia, modern Greek pronunciation, paideia, your mastery of the Greek language, rhetoric, the classics of Greek literature, and that was still very much considered part of formal education. And people from all over the East Mediterranean were coming to Athens to study under great teachers. It was a very rowdy atmosphere, lots of kind of ragweek antics, and sort of lots of semi-violent competitions between different claques of students and even different professors. I mean, and of course, this is very well captured by Gore Vidal in his novel about sort of Emperor Julian, because yes, you have the 2 Christian figures, and then the anti-Christian emperor happened to be in Athens at the same time, and Gore Vidal does wonderful things with that. So I mean, and so clearly, part of the story of Gregory and Basil is the immensely rigorous grounding in ancient Greek literature, and the fact that they could turn out prose or even poetry in the sort of hiatic ancient Greek, that was very much part of their baggage. But there was plenty else about their baggage too, of course. And in fact, I'd be inclined to argue that our conventional wisdom sort of somewhat underestimates the sort of Semitic Abrahamic baggage which those people were carrying as well. It seems that Gregory of Nazianzus came from a sort of a sect of Judaizing sect deep in Anatolia, the Ipsisterians, worshipping God Most High, El Elyon in Hebrew, Ipsistos in Greek, a sect that had possibly emerged from syncretism between Judaism and ancient Greek religion. So they were carrying sort of a lot of sort of Semitic Abrahamic baggage, as well as being utterly steeped in the formal education of classical Greece. I mean, an extraordinary mixture of things to be carrying. Now, my personal discovery, I mean, in sense, what was, I mean, I had read plenty of kind of secular critique of the early Christians as people who kind of quashed and destroyed the rich polytheistic culture. I'd also read Christian apologetics making the opposite point. What struck me personally is the enormous sort of overlap between Julian and his teachers and the Christians and their teachers. In fact, there was, I mean, they were asking the same questions. They were, Christians were studying under pagan teachers. And I mean, they were very much sort of swimming in the same intellectual waters. And these were not just sort of rationalistic waters; they were spiritual as well. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what the Neoplatonist and world of Julian had in common with the Christians is that they both had a very strong sense of the paradox that the divine is at one level completely inaccessible, and at another level, through ritual, through transcendental experience, it may be accessible. It's inaccessible to the intellect, but accessible, possibly to the emotions, or accessible through ritual and ceremony. That was, and both of them, both schools, if you like, were wrestling with both the inaccessibility and the accessibility of the divine. And I think that's a theme of early Christian thought, and very much, a theme of sort of late Neoplatonic thought. And that, I hadn't understood that commonality so well until I began reading the sources.
Is you have this incredibly rich stream of Neoplatonic thought, which is entering into the church, not solely through Basil and through Gregory, but for a period of about 100 years, starting with Origen, you start to sense that these two worlds are somehow colliding, and a dialogue that you might have thought impossible from the perplexity with which the philosophers greet St. Paul's speech on the Areopagus, if you believe the writer of Acts. This perplexity somehow becomes a form of cross-fertilization.
Yes, indeed.
Which is important both for paganism, as you see in the career and life of Julian, but also through the development of Christian doctrine.
Yes, and something that I might have added, is that one of the interesting features of the sort of early 5th century history is the house of Proclus, because that's in the 1950s. I mean, quite recently, a house was discovered. When moving the course of one of the central avenues in Athens, they discovered what had been the extremely handsome residence, the 22-room residence of a kind of priest philosopher, and identified with a fair degree of accuracy with the Platonic thinker Proclus. You could actually see how he had collected sort of classical sculptures, but how the house had presumably been taken over by Christians at a certain point, and the classical sculptures were buried or done away with. So Proclus is a figure that sort of features in both intellectual history and also in kind of recent archaeology. Now, but what you could add is that the fact that, in a sense, Proclus was on the losing side as a polytheist, but he continued to be studied, very much in Constantinople, and some people would say that the thinking of Proclus was very much part of the evolution of St. Augustine. So the cross-fertilization went on.
Yeah. You also take the story into later periods when, of course, Justinian closes the philosophical schools down, and you enter into a period which is very rigorously, strictly Christian. And as you've already said, there's not an enormous amount of evidence about what's going on in Athens in this period from the 6th to the 10th century. But we know some things, and we know particularly things around this iconic building, the Parthenon. And you mention, more than mention, you discuss the role played by Basil II, the famous Bulgar slayer, and his veneration of the icon in the temple, and then the rather interesting and rather sophisticated views of the last Orthodox Archbishop of Athens, Michael Choniatis. So you get the sense, don't you, across all of these centuries, even from very sparse evidence, that this building, its spirituality, is capable even of surmounting really revolutionary religious change, which is extraordinary, I think, in terms of tracing this thin thread through the city.
Yes, indeed. Yes, certainly from about the turn of the second Christian millennium, from 1000 onwards, yes, you see the Parthenon becoming a very, very important place of pilgrimage. And yes, Emperor Basil going there to give thanks for his victories. And it's never quite sure sort of what precisely the object of his veneration is. I mean, is it the Parthenon itself? I mean, was there some very special icon or mosaic that he was venerating, or was it just, the brilliant light that appeared to emanate, from the columns? We have this figure of the Panagia Athenotissa, the Virgin Mary in her Athenian dimension. Now, does that refer to an icon or an icon style? I think nobody knows for certain, although traces of Christian mosaics have certainly been found, and descriptions of wonderful mosaics. But it was clearly a place of absolute fascination for the pilgrim. And indeed, the contrarian argument has been made that the relative importance of the Parthenon was even greater in that Byzantine area than it was in the classical era. How? Because, in classical times, the holiest thing on the Acropolis was the Erechtheion. Whereas, in the age of Emperor Basil and Michael Choniatis, the Parthenon and its brilliant light clearly, dwarfed everything else in the city. And as you say, Michael Choniatis, the last Byzantine sort of Archbishop of Athens, he thought he'd really kind of been very unlucky when he was posted to this boondock place, where people spoke a funny dialect and the people were ignorant and corrupt and so on. But he became passionately in love with the Parthenon, and he constructed very sophisticated arguments as to why the worship of the Virgin Mary, the true Virgin, was greatly superior to that of the false Virgin Athena. But nonetheless, and there was something about the building that fascinated him and which made him into a very loyal Athenian.
Yeah. I think I should bring us into modern times. I think that's probably why I was asked to come and talk. One of the things that you do in the book, while showing that there are obviously these periods of discontinuity when actually the city becomes rather unimportant, its population is small, there's not a great deal of historical record. But then again, with the Greek Revolution and the arrival of Otho and his court, suddenly Athens is yet again coming to the forefront of Greek life. So we're dealing with another period where Athens is yet again of enormous importance. And indeed, I know we call Thessaloniki the Symprotevousa of Athens, but that's always seemed to me to be rather a form of politeness, because Athens is the dominant force in Greek political and cultural life in a way which I don't think not even London is quite so dominant. You, in talking about this modern city, draw a number of parallels with the ancient city, and of course your very good example of Frederiki and Elpiniki, I think, is a good way of doing this. But you're also very realistic about the significance of modern Athens, hugely important in terms of Greece, but often marked, particularly in the 20th century, by periods of weakness and actually rather tumultuous events that almost bring the city to its knees. Just let me quote something. You say, in modern Athens, there have been tortuous discussions about how to conduct oneself from a position of weakness, when to capitulate to overwhelming power, when to stand firm, how and when to seek some advantage at the margins. This, I think, is a rather important observation, because what you're describing is a city, again, of a certain sort of wisdom, a certain realpolitik, which kind of triumphs. And I wonder if you might just like to talk about this in relation to the economic crisis. You and I saw it at its height from 2010 to 2015, but we seem to have got over that. And I wonder if you could just say something about the longue durée in relation to the latest bout of crisis.
Well, if I could preface that with just a word about the 20th century taken as a whole. Yes, I mean, of course, there were unspeakable tragedies unfolded in Athens in the course of the 20th century. The Cambriana, the Civil War, the occupation, and then, I mean, Athens sort of bore the brunt of another terrible tragedy in the 20s and 30s, as people arrived in enormous numbers from the Asia Minor catastrophe, and built houses or had houses built for them. So in a sense, the whole story of the 20th century is one catastrophe after another, but with the tremendous power of adaptation and absorption and pragmatism, but with the unfortunate rider, in a way, that Athens gains importance in relation to the rest of the Greek world to a dysfunctional extent, and particularly in the 50s, that when the country is ruined by civil war and sort of political division, and people pour in from the countryside into Athens, and it doubles, trebles in size. The aesthetics of the city are badly damaged, but somehow it functions. It functions remarkably well. I mean, the utilities never stop functioning. So looking at the 20th century, I mean, one is struck by the successive tragedies, extraordinary pragmatism, extraordinary adaptation, but the fact that Athens comes to occupy a place in Hellenism as a whole, which is dysfunctionally large, and certainly in Greece as a whole. I think it's a commonplace that, especially since the 50s, the sheer size of Greater Athens has been at the expense of the rest of the country, and I mean, we both saw when the crisis was at its worst, the signs of near collapse in the whole system. When sort of entire blocks of shops were shut down, and there was a kind of despair because politics seemed to have no meaning. It didn't matter who you voted for, because it was the Troika who was governing the country. I mean, really, touching the edge of sort of a sort of social and psychological breakdown. I mean, from which, I felt I saw Athens was making quite a sort of spectacular and exuberant recovery in the years that I sort of spent most time there, which is 2018, 2019. And it was sort of at times joyous to behold the kind of inventiveness with which Athens was getting its act together again, and presenting a much more attractive and sophisticated tourist product to visitors, a much wider range of visitors than before, much wider sort of seasonal range as well. And if there was a mildly sort of positive side effect about the crisis, it prompted some Athenians to go back to their home villages or to their home islands or home regions, and do things like start organic farms, or even sort of unusual forms of tourism. And there was a sort of a steady trickle out of Athens, back into the provinces, back into the islands, which I think is probably to the benefit of both places. And also, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, at the same time, you also point to what you see as a new form. At least I think you're saying it's new, a new form of cosmopolitanism. I mean, as we know, Greeks have always traveled since historical records began. We know that Greeks have been traveling and founding cities around the Mediterranean basin. But so cosmopolitanism is always part of Greek and Athenian life. But I think you've very very shrewdly picked on a new form of cosmopolitanism, which we've seen over the last few years actually arising from the crisis.
Yes, that's right. And look, I mean, I freely admit that I wanted to accentuate the positive as much as possible. I mean, I found the interactions between sort of native Athenians and some of the new immigrant communities were, in some cases, very, very positive and very generating entirely new realities. And I even, I became a bit fascinated by the phenomenon of the kind of, Greek Nigerian or Greek African rap artists who were rapping in Greek, of course, and sometimes making very, witty puns in Greek and sort of, puns on Greek history and so on. And oddly enough, kind of quite favored by sort of young middle-class kids. It wasn't, so very interesting fusion going on there. And I got to know some of the sort of the players in that world. But of course I don't deny the fact that the social peace of Athens remains quite fragile. We saw in 2008 with those that from a standing start the place was suddenly ablaze with riots triggered by the death of a schoolboy, and it was a really, really frightening reminder of how fragile the social peace of a great city can be. And that wasn't at a time of acute economic crisis. It's actually quite hard to pinpoint what triggered the 2008 riots. It was a sort of almost a sort of a dysfunction of the state, certainly a dysfunction of the certainly of the police, and I'd be you'd be a fool to say that could never happen again. But I certainly thoroughly enjoyed all the ways in which Athens seemed to be responding sort of creatively and constructively to the new social realities.
Great. John, is this a time to return to you as our syndonistes?
Sure, yeah. So I actually have a question about sort of almost technique, if you like, Bruce, because I was intrigued by the way in which the narrative often proceeds by a sort of series of vignettes. And I particularly noticed that in the later parts of the book. And then I was thinking back to the earlier parts as well. And it seems to be the same there. And I wonder if two things. I mean, I wonder if that's a particular technique you chose in order to engage the reader or to make the narrative more vivid, or partly also because it's a way of smoothing over the vastly different levels of sources and types of sources you have going back to the very beginning up to the modern age, where practically everything is documented in real time.
Indeed, yeah. Yes, well, look, I mean, I would say, bear in mind, I'm a journalist, okay? I mean, I write features for The Economist and in the past for the Financial Times, and so I'm trained to kind of to find arresting anecdotes, and you're absolutely right that sometimes the quality of the information available varies so enormously that and you have to find ways of achieving some kind of continuity of tone, and anecdotes are one way of doing that, or just using the available material to construct sort of human stories. I mean, talking about the occupation in the Second World War, I mean, I tried to sort of ask myself, well, what do I know? I mean, what in my personal experience, can I bring to this? Well, I mean, as a journalist in Athens in the 80s, I was lucky enough to meet Manolis Glezos several times and have conversations with him about different things. And it was around that time that the full details of his extraordinary escapade of taking down the swastika from the Acropolis, came to light. The story was fully told only around then. And it's a thundering good story, which he tells very well. And it seemed to me right to devote quite a lot of space to that, because well, I mean, he's such an extraordinary person, but it's a way of encapsulating a lot of truths about the occupation, and the extraordinary bravery that he and his friend must have needed. And the symbolic importance as well of taking down that hated banner that was fluttering over the city, and it brings you back to the quasi-spiritual importance of the Acropolis. And one of the most revealing things is that he and his friend said is that we burrowed our way up the Mycenaean tunnel, almost a vertical tunnel, and then we emerged into the moonlight, and we did a kind of dance because we thought we were worthy of our ancestors. And it really, I mean, he presents it as an intensely spiritual experience, as well as a feat of daring do as well. So that, that's the kind of anecdote I was looking for.
Great. Okay, so let's throw it open to our audience. We have some questions in the Q&A. Just a reminder to everyone, if you want us to pose those questions, then do type them into the Q&A box. And a reminder to our panelists that although Bruce is kind of on the hot spot, please feel free to intervene and join the discussion. So from Dimitra Andonopoulou, she asks, in writing your book about Athens, were you at all inspired by Simon Sebag Montefiore's Jerusalem biography? Both books span thousands of years, are loosely written, and were for her utterly unputdownable, which is a compliment both to you and to that as well.
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, I'm very flattered to be compared with that book. I mean, I think that writing about the history of Jerusalem is both easier and harder. I mean, there is, because there are things to say about every era of Jerusalem's history. The material taken as a whole is probably richer, but it's also the case that sifting the archaeological evidence in Jerusalem is an intensely controversial business. And if you're looking at the history of the Dome of the Rock or the Temple Mount, and you're asking yourself, which bits of archaeological evidence do we single out, and is it possible to find a single coherent history? I mean, that's an immensely contentious business, and I can't quite see an equivalent in Greece, possibly because, in a sense, the modern Greek state has prevailed, and its view that the most important thing in the Parthenon and its environs is Periclean Athens. That view has prevailed unchallengingly, and so you're not plunging into the midst of an ongoing controversy as you would be when writing about Jerusalem. So I mean, I salute people who can write longue durée histories of Jerusalem. It's both easier and harder than what I did.
Great, thanks. Simple question, difficult answer.
Okay.
From Catherine Smith, would Athenian-style democracy work in the UK today?
Well, good, but yes.
Maybe a one-word answer, I don't know.
Well, look, I mean, certainly, of course, the most striking feature of Athenian democracy is that it was direct. You weren't voting for representatives. The people were men, free men who were neither, people who were not slaves or female or foreign. So free male citizens were voting on matters that directly affected them. That they were voting, to allocate money for wars in which they would fight, and there was a sense of taking, really, direct responsibility for their fate, which is, very different from the House of Commons. But I sometimes feel that sort of local democracy in modern times, the sort of local democracy that you get sort of in a small town, or perhaps in a small, not even a state, but even a small, a small town in the United States, to some extent, it has that feel of directness, of people, participating in deliberations, whose outcomes will directly affect them, and for which they will be held responsible. So I think certainly there are aspects of ancient Greek democracy that we can study and sort of perhaps draw some lessons from.
Well, and there are.
Oh, yeah. John and I both again, exactly.
Bettany, over to you.
And then well, I mean, only to say that kind of, again, that kind of rather hopeful thing with direct democracy, that the point that it is not just that you're voting on laws, you're deciding what laws you should be voting on, which gives you the most, extraordinary agency and extraordinary responsibility. And just because we kind of dealt with Socrates rather briefly at the beginning, that feels to me one of his greatest gifts to the political dialogue, his point that democracy is all very well, but it only works if we are fit to be democrats, and that only happens through education and understanding and the pursuit of wisdom. So yeah, I would say the answer is potentially yes, but we have to be good democrats and worthy of democracy in order to effect that kind of direct democracy.
I think I agree with that, and I think one also sees through the Athenian example that a direct democracy itself needs to bind itself with rules, and one sees the direct democracy of Athens forced to countermand decisions, hasty decisions. Yes, it's taken by whatever majority on the whim of emotion, having to countermand them a day or two later when second thoughts seem wiser. Of course, I wouldn't be the one to draw attention to the use of referendums in modern democracies, but referendums are forms of direct democracy. And one sees that the rules which surround those referendums are really important to their acceptance by society as a whole.
I'm going to try and pull two questions together. They're not exactly the same, but they're kind of around the same theme. First of all, from Yanni Papastavru, who says, visiting from cosmopolitan London in the late 90s and 2000s, I was shocked by a general anti-immigrant sentiment, including by middle-class Athenians. Often one would hear sentiments, things such as, do not go anywhere near Monia Square, you'll get mugged by Albanians. Have such prejudices changed in recent years? And perhaps an aspect of a similar question, but a much broader question from Susan Jones, is Athens a Middle Eastern or a European city?
Gosh, indeed, yes. Now, well, I think, I would be dishonest if I said that sort of anti-immigrant sentiment has disappeared completely, or that you can't. But I think one significant thing that has changed is that a second generation of immigrants has grown up, and in particular, the first wave of immigrants, became in many cases from Albania, and they have a lot of them have had children who've been through the Greek school system, done extremely well often, and I think that, especially through the success of the second generation and through the success of that generation in the schools, I think it's become more widely accepted that there is more than one way of being Greek. And of course, you have the extraordinary phenomenon of Giannis Antetokounmpo, the 7-foot-tall Greek Nigerian basketball player, who is possibly the most popular personality in Athens, and grew up in the rough district of Sepolia, but still an extremely loyal sort of Athenian, and patters away in his kind of working class Athenian Greek. Getting a bit rusty now, but he can still patter away, and adored by the Greek public. And I think a very, very important step in sort of persuading people that there is more than one way of being Greek. So that would be on the hopeful side. Now, tell me, and the other question is Greece. Is Greece European or Middle Eastern?
That's the question.
Well, here's the question. I think that Greece has always been Middle Eastern in a sense, even when if we had been able to continue our discussion about Neoplatonic thought, and I think I would have made the point that if you look at the thought of Plato or Pythagoras, you will find sources and inspirations that certainly don't come from the 12 Olympian gods, that come from somewhere much further east. And come from, and if we look at the life tour of Pythagoras even, and the fact that he spent time apparently in sort of present day Lebanon, Syria, perhaps Jerusalem, to me, sort of Middle Eastern influences were feeding into the mainstream of Hellenism, from ancient times. And so, and it wasn't just a matter of kind of, as we sometimes think of Greece sort of projecting its power eastwards. On the contrary, there was a perpetual flowing backward and forward of ideas and traditions and intellectual impulses between Greece and the Levant. And I think that's that continues to the present day, shall we say.
I mean, just again to chip in there, that I'm obviously in the Arabic-speaking world at the moment, and was talking about the fact that I was going to be talking about Athens tonight. And the number of people came up and said, "Oh, can you ask about Plato?" Because Plato is an incredibly, Aflatonas is the Arabic version, is an incredibly popular name in the Arabic world. And of course, as you say, John, that it's a kind of three-way traffic, in that there's a huge amount of influence coming from Babylon originally. And I think once more Babylonian cuneiform is translated, we're going to understand that even more. But of course, the kind of brilliance is that when we try to search out some of the very earliest documents of Plato, Plato, for instance. The second oldest surviving extant copy of Plato is in the Caroline Library above the Caroline Mosque in Fez, because of that thought being so central in the medieval period to the Middle Eastern world as well. So it's, you know, it really is a continuous cycle of influence and of interest.
Susan Biddle asks, fascinating discussion. Where did you find the most interesting and revealing sources for the post-Roman and pre-Ottoman Empire period of Athenian history?
Gosh, well, I mean, yes, but I mean, post-Roman, literally post-Roman, sort of between 500 and 1000. I mean, the sources, the literary sources are very, very thin indeed. I mean, we have, you know, the fact that certain sort of Byzantine empresses came from Athens. We have, you know, the sort of bizarre fact that, you know, Saint Theodore, one of the kind of founding saints of the English Church, Theodore, you know, is said to have had his education in Athens. Now, what can that possibly mean? To me, it probably means that sort of the word Athens was used as a sort of a cipher for, you know, a rigorous Greek education. It didn't necessarily physically happen. Look, and so there are, I mean, the sources are frankly very, very thin, from 500 to 1000. And then, of course, yeah, there is some archaeological work has been done, you know, by people like Alison France. I mean, she studied how, you know, the water system of Athens, which was very sophisticated at its height, became progressively less sophisticated, you know, during that darkish period. And you know, a lot of Greece was under sort of the influence of Slavic tribes, and, you know, Byzantine emperors used Athens as a sort of a stronghold, and sometimes with modest success. But it's a very, very shadowy period indeed. You know, from 1000 onwards, well, of course, you know, we have, you know, the Byzantine historical sources, the rather extensive writing of Michael Choniatis, who's a very, very colourful and sort of, you know, lively writer, you know, expressing rhetorically his admiration for Athens, but also, you know, his sermons, but also, you know, his frustration with the physical kind of degradation of Athens, and the fact that the present day Athenians are frankly, you know, not a very well educated lot, and they exasperate him with their corruption and their lack of education and their poor speech. So lots of colourful stuff in the writings of Michael Choniatis. Then, you know, the so-called Frankish period, I mean, that really is a kind of, that is a recondite field of study. And, you know, not you know, from the, you know, well, first, you know, the French knights, and then the Catalan mercenaries, and then the kind of Italian, you know, the Acciaiuoli dynasty. You know, there's a wonderful historian, Dionysius Stathagopoulos, who was in London for a while and is now in Cyprus, and he's managed to come at the, you know, the late Frankish period by having a look at his sort of 4 sort of semi-Hellenized sort of Italian princesses from that period, that we can sort of whose existence, you know, we can learn from written sources to some extent, and from documents, from signatures. He's having to be quite creative, I must say. But the, you know, among the handful of people who really studied Frankish Greece, I mean, there is the wonderful William Miller, who was a journalist first and foremost, and then a writer. You know, Kenneth Seton, Princeton professor, and they, you know, Seton in particular, you know, did source work in Catalan. I mean, there is source work. There's material you can read in Barcelona about this, but it's a very, you know, and he was also in Venice quite a lot. But this is hard work, and, you know, I don't claim to have been at the coalface, but I took what I could from Seton and Miller, and I sort of and indeed from Dionysius, and you know, did my best with it.
Good. I think we should begin to wind up. So I have 2 more questions. One, because it's come up twice, and it's in relation to Neoplatonism, I think, the work of Pierre Hadot, whether he was an influence on you writing. This is from Nikki Leger, I suppose, or Ledger. Apologies if I've mangled your name. Was he an influence on your thinking about
I have to confess not.
It's always unfair
but I have to confess not, but I promise that he will be in future.
It's always unfair to put an author on the spot about a particular source. And let me end with probably an appropriate question for the end from Ian Callahan. What do you think are the aspects of the character of Athens or Athenians? And Bettany and Michael and John could both join in here. What do you think are the aspects of the character of the Athens or the Athenians that have enabled its survival over the centuries? And how will these help it safely navigate the challenges we face today, climate change, globalization, etc.?
Well, but yes, I mean, I think that, I mean, to talk about the physical aspects of Athens and Attica, I mean, I think that Athens is both blessed and challenged by nature. I mean, it is near the sea, but it's also a safe-ish distance from the sea. It's surrounded by mountains, which are, a source of resources and protection to some extent. Each of the mountains sort of, has its own gifts. Mount Ametis Imitos, famous for its honey. Mount Pendelicon, famous for its marble, and so but significantly, Athens has never been self-sufficient, or Attica rather has never been self-sufficient in food. I mean, you can produce olives and grapes there, but you can never produce enough wheat to satisfy a large population. And I think, as Thucydides argues quite cogently, I mean, that has been a spur to energy, to feed a largest population in Athens. You have to go out and trade and sort of, to some extent, exercise maritime power over the high seas and found colonies and find alternative sources of grain in the Black Sea, in Egypt, and so on. So the very fact that Attica is relatively poor in soil has been a stimulus to energy. Now, I mean, in the age of climate change, it's a very important point. Athens is challenged, and indeed we've seen, in the last calendar year, we've seen acute and tragic sort of challenges which are interrelated. Because you have the problem of forest fires, on Mount Parnitha, or some of the mountains. The deforestation of the mountains around Athens has been a concern, since Plato's time, but especially in modern times, and especially indeed during the German occupation, efforts were made to reforest the mountains of Attica, the mountains around Athens, but they are very, very vulnerable in the age of climate change to forest fire. And that, of course, is interlinked with the problem of floods, especially with, the three great rivers of Athens, the Ilissos, the Kiphisos, the Ilianos, all virtually covered over. I mean, that sends water into, well, first of all, it creates the risk of floods right in the middle of Athens, but it also diverts water into other parts of Attica, and with mountainsides being eroded, being denuded, the risk of floods, as we've seen, becomes acute. And just in the last sort of 6 months or so, or since last August, we've seen both terrible fires in Athens and terrible floods, and the problems very closely interrelated, unfortunately. So there are real challenges for Athens in the age of climate change.
John, could I have also a go at that? And I think Bettany also wants to have
next. I think you beat it this time, Bettany.
I mean, I would answer it in terms which I think are not only familiar to Bruce, but are very clearly sketched out in the book. I think Athenians benefit from two things which are very noticeable to a foreigner. First, they are very proud of themselves as Athenians and are adept at being Athenian, part of the political, economic, and social game of the city itself. It doesn't matter who you're speaking to, Athenians know that they're part of the political, social, and economic warp and weft of the city in a way that I think sometimes surprises those of us who feel rather light attachments to our capital cities. So Athenians know they're part of the game of being Athenian, but secondly, they're also very deeply rooted and often rather differently rooted. They know where their villages are, and they have a strong sense that they live in two parallel communities, their Athenianness and their rootedness, their patrida, where they come from. And this, I think, gives a really marked and rather exceptional sense to the quality of Athenian citizenship. And I think it's one of the skills and virtues of Bruce's book that he really draws that out.
Absolutely. And just to kind of add very briefly, sorry about the noise, we're doing all the rushes behind us for the filming today, that the I wouldn't presume to, not being Athenian and only really understanding the Bronze Age and the 5th century BCE, but what I see in that time, both the Bronze Age and the 5th century BCE, is to go back to the title of Bruce's book, is an immersion in wisdom and the possibilities of wisdom, but wisdom in quite a Homeric sense of techne, a kind of practical understanding of the world. And I always think that, if you have an Athenian female friend who has a good contact book and a mobile phone, anything in the world is possible. There is a sort of absolute, a delight and certainty that what should happen will happen. And that feels to me that that's a very Athenian spirit.